My informative presentation is about the Economic Recovery Program, better known as the Marshall Plan. Near the end of World War II, the Allies met to determine the future of the European continent. The Encyclopedia Britannica noted that the Marshall Plan would avoid another economic depression situation that occurred after World War I. Implementing this plan, the economies of the European nations would survive. The German economy for the last 10 years was producing only military hardware. So how do you turn around a country's industry where it has been based on one industry and now it is completely destroyed? The European continent lacked the money or credit to rebuild, where the people would be starving, people would have no place to live, and there would be no functioning governments. The George C. Marshall Foundation states that the Economic Recovery Program, more commonly known as the Marshall Plan, became the roadmap, a $13 billion aid package funded by the U.S. It's distributed among European nations for the rebuilding of industry, restoring agriculture, regaining financial stability, and to reestablish governments, and for the United States to limit Soviet influence throughout the region. The Allied High Command knew the vast destruction it would take to end the war in Europe, and wanting not to repeat the hard lesson that occurred after World War I, the Allies devised plans that would incorporate the rebuilding of destroyed countries through economic aid. Now to get the backing of the American people. On June 5, 1947, Secretary of State George C. Marshall spoke at Harvard University about the destroyed cities, towns, rail systems, mining industry, the lack of housing, the lack of food, and the threat of communism. Going into great detail about the atmosphere of distrust between the countries, Secretary Marshall expressed that even the countries of Germany and Austria still had yet to sign a peace treaty. Expressing the needs of the European continent, he then laid out a plan of what must be done. His first priority was to restore confidence between European people in rebuilding business confidence and the exchange of each other's currency. America was the only country in the world that has the means by which to meet these needs and the obligation to do so, not only to stabilize their economies, but to benefit ours. On April 2, 1948, Congress passed the Economic Cooperation Act, which authorized the Marshall Plan. U.S. History Containment provided, quote, President Truman signed it the next day and stated, few presidents had had the opportunity to sign legislation of such importance, close quote. A specially created bureau run by Paul G. Hoffman distributed the $13 billion of economic aid over the next 4 years. The funds were used to rebuild infrastructure, create jobs, provide food, housing, medical care, to purchase equipment, encourage political involvement, but most importantly, reestablish trade between nations. Most of the aid was in the form of grants, and the remainder incorporated the use of loans. 16 countries led by the United Kingdom and France formed a European committee that scheduled a 4-year timetable to implement the program. With the start of the Korean War, the Marshall Plan was phased out and the results were calculated. U.S. history shows that the Marshall Plan created an economic boom in Western Europe, and by the end of the program, Europe had doubled industrial output compared to the year before the war started. Some Americans had protested against the cost, but Americans spent more on alcohol than was spent on the Marshall Plan during the same period. The economic boom in Western Europe helped to fuel the post-war economic boom in the United States. But most importantly, Europe never faced a communist takeover, even with the warning of General George S. Patton, who wanted to go right through Berlin and conquer the Russians. Although the involvement of the Soviet Union and Eastern European nations was an initial possibility, the Soviet Union, apprehensive over possible U.S. economic domination of its Eastern European satellites, and Stalin's reluctance to open up his secret society to Westerners, doomed the idea. The Marshall Plan produced a resurgence of industry and extensive investment into the European continent. This stimulation assisted the U.S. economy by opening up markets for the American goods. Secretary Marshall's plan succeeded by providing needed financial assistance and the cooperation of all the nations in restoring the European continent, therefore reducing the chances of another worldwide depression and possible war. Secretary Marshall's plan was recognized as a great humanitarian effort, and George C. Marshall became the only general to receive a Nobel Prize for Peace. The Marshall Plan became the concept of U.S. foreign aid programs and is now an integral part of that policy within the United States Department of State. Thank you.